And yeah, good morning, good afternoon, everybody, depending where you are. Thanks for joining us. I will press on quickly. There's a quick bit about myself and Paolo. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at SideTrade. I'll tell you a little bit about us in a moment. And Paolo is Associate Director in the Advisory Division at KPMG. I'm sure everybody knows who KPMG is, but you'll hear from him in a moment too. So SideTrade is an international company. We're based in Europe and North America. We have about 2,700 clients, and our single-minded focus is we create and support order-to-cash platforms, or an order-to-cash platform used by organizations around the world to accelerate cash and increase revenue for B2B organizations. So effectively, we are all about helping organizations to create a cash culture, embed that in the organization, and therefore optimize working capital and improve their cash flow. So in terms of creating a cash culture, well, what we're going to talk about today is kind of, I suppose, what is it, why do it, how do we achieve it, and so on. What is it? I mean, it's, in simple terms, it's having an organization that is not just in the finance team, but right across the organization from top to bottom, across all divisions, are focused on cash and getting cash into the business, as opposed to other kind of financial measures like revenue, for example, which aren't always the same thing, as we all know. And of course, it's increasingly in the spotlight today. So in terms of, I guess, why is it important? First of all, I'm going to bring Paolo in here just to talk about the kind of working capital picture and why creating a cash culture is important. So Paolo.
Thanks, David. Cheers. Yeah, so many of the businesses I work with are on the first step of a journey to embedding a cash culture. They might have been a family-owned business previously which is purchased by private equity, which gives it a very different flavor to cash. Usually we start our projects with a diagnostic of working capital and review of the maturity of the cash culture. So our approach looks at payables, receivables, inventory, and other non-trade working capital. So we've developed a hypothesis database of over 200 initiatives or levers. We can then filter this by the relevant sector or industry to see which are the most effective opportunities to test. And then we split those down into those that are quick win or compliance opportunities. For example, getting customers to pay to their credit terms, applying contractual minimal order quantities into the system correctly, or another example is stop paying any suppliers early. In over 10 years of projects, I've only seen one example of a business which had no early supplier payments, and that wasn't in the UK, that was in the Nordics. And then, if I keep going, so an example of a process improvement, this could be optimizing the number of payment runs you have. Pretty rare to see daily payment runs now. Then we think through term changes, where you can negotiate payment or credit term changes. And then the final area is looking at more structural changes to reconfigure the working capital flow of the business. So structural example could be reviewing a supply chain, making a decision to source from Europe versus the Far East, for example, which will have implications on both payment terms and inventory days. Then the final factor which we consider is financing, which can play a part, whether this is supply chain financing or factoring of receivables. So it can be a good lever to think about, but often there's a cost associated with it.
Yeah, so I guess that's almost a last resort, is that you try and sort out everything else first, and if there's still an issue, turn to that.
Yeah, exactly. It's a conversation I'm having with my current client. The head of procurement is very keen to look at reverse factoring, supply chain finance, as a way of increasing the DPO. But actually, he can get more out of it by pushing the terms himself further, because of course there's a financing charge and there's more he could do in-house, really.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Okay. And this slide really kind of sums up what I mentioned at the beginning about this being very much about the whole organization.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So there's working capital by nature touches many different parts of an organization. Some of them can have behaviors which are negative to working capital. So if we took procurement as an example, David, their objective is to obtain goods for manufacture, and their key priority is often to reduce the cost base. So this current client I've mentioned, they're a European paper business, and the CFO's view is that the procurement team did an absolutely brilliant job based on their objective last year, which was to take £20 million of cost out. But they did that at the expense of payment terms. And they really didn't have a cash culture in the business historically. They were actually a family-owned business. And I often get asked, what can you do to change that? In this example, you could think about incentives for procurement. You could change the incentives from rather just targeting costs, look at terms as well. You could put in place controls. So any terms that are over X days, depending on the country, requires a CFO sign-off. But that's one area where you often see an almost negative behavior to working capital.
And I guess, I mean, sales is another one, I think, isn't it, where you can see very different incentives, and their compensation in particular is often not linked to cash, and they're not motivated by sort of thinking about cash.
Yeah. Many examples of sales organizations that are, or sales-driven organizations which are looking to maximize revenue. So that is fairly common. Key priority for them is service levels as well as sales, not collecting the cash in at the end. There could also be an important link to unbilled revenue, which we've both seen on media technology companies, where sales have involvement, where they should be approving the end of a project, for example, which will then lead it to be invoiced. So that is another typical area where you might have differing priorities.
Yeah, I was hosting a roundtable of senior finance leaders recently, and the CFO of a big European company said they'd completely changed their compensation so that sales were now effectively paid only on receipt of cash rather than closing the order, which obviously has a massive sort of mindset change in the way that sales then behaves and how they're focused.
Yeah, that is that's something I've actually seen in professional services. Interestingly, where bonuses at year end are only paid out of the cash that's collected, not the invoices that you've sent out to your clients, which clearly changes behavior.
Stops that rush for the last minute billing at the end of the year, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah. How about kind of production and warehousing? What's their kind of focus and impact on cash?
Well, the main objective of production is really meeting their production targets and ensuring there's availability of material. So this can lead to increased inventory. There's a few factors that can cause this. I think it's often due to a lack of data or KPIs around slow moving and obsolete inventory. You quite often also see a proliferation of the number of SKUs in a business where you see an increased inventory. And their priority is really customer service levels. There's a risk aversion to holding less stock. An example, I think, if I was thinking about examples that I've worked on with clients, a recent client I've worked with, a plastic manufacturer, we reviewed their slow-moving SKUs. Many of them were volatile items, so they weren't ordered very frequently by customers. So as simple as changing the attributes of these SKUs in their system to make to stock, to make to order, had a really big impact. But it is linked really to the wider S&OP process that you have in your business when we talk about production or inventory being held. And forecasting future sales is also really, really important aspect, which is a more difficult thing to do. There was an industrial gas manufacturer I worked with out of the US, and they had a very interesting and complex supply chain. They sort of bought virgin gas from Asia, They blended gas, which they manufactured from components that they purchased, and they also reclaimed gas from customers for free or a very nominal fee, because these are kind of regulated gases you can't just let out into the atmosphere, which will ruin our ozone layer. But that meant that they had a very difficult challenge of getting sight of what they would be sort of reclaiming or what levels of stock they should be purchasing. So we did a kind of 3-month project with them to look at their forecasting model specifically to try and take into account these different aspects.
Interesting. Okay. And warehousing and logistics is what mostly about trying to get goods to customers as quickly as possible, so you can build them and start collecting cash.
Yeah, absolutely. Which should have a positive impact on working capital, because faster delivery reduces inventory. At the same time, it is an interesting one to look into. The plastic manufacturer I mentioned, they had 3 massive silos for their raw material resin. And when they shifted some production to other countries, they still found that they were filling those 3 silos as they were before. It's just part of their behavior. Another example is an auto distribution business that had hundreds of warehouses dotted across the country, across Europe. And sometimes they had multiple warehouses in small regional areas, which itself does lead to, I guess, a loss of control over your SKUs and slow moving if they're spread across so many different warehouses.
Interesting. Okay, and then let's look at embedding a cash culture, how we actually go about doing that.
Yeah, thanks. So this is how we usually look at cash culture, and how you can start from sort of the project level all the way up to the DNA, or it being part of your DNA. And there are 4 main factors. So the first is looking at visibility. Actually having conversations over the last month or last few months, cash has really, maybe unsurprisingly, become more of a number 1 item for boards, which is really important. So that senior input is key. And then more than that is, if you can't measure cash and working capital, it's really hard to track and improve. So KPIs, reporting are super important. As well as that, it's meeting to review the KPIs, making sure that you're not just reporting for the sake of it, creating a cottage industry. The next 2 factors are control and organization. We do always assign some responsible owners accountable for a working capital initiative or project, which is very important in itself. But you could also, as we've mentioned, go further and look at incentivizing people, incentivizing teams based on cash and working capital targets. It's just important to make sure you get that right, and you're not asking people to perform and achieve targets which are outside of their personal control. So we usually do that at the more senior levels. And then the final point, it's capability. So an obvious but important point is you can't start changing reward structures or expect people to do things if they don't have the training or tools to make changes. So you need to upskill your teams, make sure there's training available. And that goes back to the levers that I mentioned at the beginning. If you're breaking down your payables, receivables, inventory, but also around the cash flow forecasting, do they have the skills to be able to do that? And finally, benchmarking is a great tool. So an auto parts manufacturer that I was working with, we put in place a overdues cup. So you had to get overdues below 10% at year end. And there was a system based on scoring each of the months. And it was done on a regional structure. So the Japanese team would come in wearing the national rugby shirts at month end, and it created a very good competitive element to making sure that overdues were reduced.
Definitely helps in getting that focus.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for that. I guess one aspect that underpins a lot of this, right from, you talked about measuring cash flow, cash forecasting and so on, having dashboards and KPIs and so on, is obviously and right down to, at the sort of individual level, at training and focus on the process. A lot of that can be underpinned by technology. And I guess that's where a company like SideTrade comes in. We see a lot of organizations who don't have the technology in place to be able to do that. Quite simply, they can't really do accurate cash flow forecasting. They can't monitor their cash position well, and they can't, even if they come up with the processes, impose them in the right way across the organization. So, SideTrade, obviously, we were all about creating an ordered cash platform, which we've built over 20 years, and all of our organizations, our customers, use that to optimize working capital and to manage these processes, streamline them, and automate them as much as possible. But recently, we've been thinking a lot about cash culture, and we've introduced a few innovations. I just wanted to touch on those because I think they're quite interesting, and they just show some ways you can really start driving cash culture. One of them is around motivating cash collectors. So, obviously cash culture starts in the finance team, and but a lot of collectors in teams, if they haven't got good technology, they're working on spreadsheets, and it's hard to measure what they're doing, what their impact is, and how they're performing against each other. So Cash Target that we produced is like a gamification system. Really, it helps you give cash collectors targets to hit, helps them see how they're progressing, and also how they're doing against each other, a bit like your kind of challenge cup you refer to. Add some sort of competition into the process, but also more importantly at the management level, allows you to monitor progress individual by individual, team by team, region by region, to really make sure that you're absolutely focused on collecting that cash and getting it into the business as fast as possible. But another area we see as a real gap in a lot of organizations is dispute management, payment disputes. And there's this, we know that about 1 in 7 invoices will go into dispute. And there'll be some reason why the customer doesn't pay it. It might be a mistake with the invoice, but it might also be a mistake with the order. What was delivered, what was packed, so damaged goods, could be the original sales order that was actually recorded wrong or something. So it can have an impact right across the organization. And as you see here, once that invoice goes into dispute, and the longer it's not paid, the less likely it is that it's ever going to get paid. So it's really important that companies focus on this and put some discipline and process around it. And because of that cross-organizational nature of disputes, or it can involve sales, it could be operations, it could be warehousing, it could be any number of teams across the organization. Typically, it's not controlled well. Everybody thinks it's the finance team's problem, and it's very hard for finance to get other people motivated, but also just to give them the visibility of what the issue is and how it is. And if you're just sending emails out or chasing people with calls, it's unlikely to be a very structured process. So what we've introduced as part of our order cash platform is a system to manage those dispute cases called Digital Case. It's an online dispute management system that just puts in place process and controls and allows everybody to see what's going on. And then most recently, literally in the last few weeks, we've actually launched something even more kind of exciting, we think, in terms of pushing that visibility out across the organization, called Cash Culture, in fact, which is a Salesforce app. Many of our customers use Salesforce CRM for their customer-facing staff, their sales, their account management teams, and so on. And so by using that pushes out information on customer payment disputes right to the people at the kind of coalface, the account managers, the customer managers, the salespeople. And it will actually, that information will pop up in the customer record. So if a salesperson's about to call a customer, or an account manager is going to go and make a visit, they'll have there on their phone or on their laptop, they'll see that there's a problem, the customer hasn't paid something. That could, it might be a problem because they might not want to buy again from you if you can't get that solved, or it might even mean that, that account's put on hold. And so on. So it's really about getting everybody to collaborate across the organization which of course collaboration is absolutely, underpins the whole concept of cash culture and driving that across an organization. So that's something we think is really very, very unique actually, and quite exciting, getting organizations to really focus on solving disputes, which, as I say, can have a big impact on cash flow for an organization. So just finally, we were going to, I think we've got a case study. Paolo, did you want to talk us through that?
Yeah, exactly. So we pulled out an example of a company. It was a large global media company that when we started working with them, they had a very limited cash culture 2-3 years ago. We did an initial working capital diagnostic, identified around £110 million of opportunity. We then worked with the CFO over the next 12 months to establish KPIs, put in place a reporting and review structure, develop a cash flow forecast. And the CFO herself was very proactive. She held weekly calls with each of the regions to challenge them on variances in the cash flow forecast and really probe the sort of why there were variances. And that's a very important aspect of cash flow forecasting, is having that continuous feedback loop. The KPIs were interesting at this business. They had different regions calculating DSO differently. As an example, what one region thought was a DSO of 16 days was recalculated to 38 days, which meant that it was very difficult at the beginning to compare regions or track with confidence. And so we standardized all of those KPIs. The debtor side is probably where they had the greatest success. So they brought in the side trade tool to start with. They centralized credit control and changed a number of processes. Through all of this, their overdues came down significantly. The CFO quote that I put on here is, she said that the year-on-year cash impact has been quite phenomenal. The cash culture has really improved over 20 months, and cash is a top priority now. So it is a number one board item agenda for this business. And then I think most promisingly is, I asked the CFO if she thought there was more to be done or if they'd achieved what they wanted. And she said, we have many tens and hundreds of millions of overdues to still go after. The job's never really done until we're sort of 5% overdue. They'd already reduced it from circa 20% down to 10% in certain regions. So no, they've done a very good job from a difficult starting position.
Yeah, it's one of those jobs that's never actually finished, is it? It's all about incremental improvement, but also sitting on top of everything and making sure those those processes continue to work and adapt.
Yeah, absolutely. And they did. They put in place some training as well. They rolled out some training on working capital to different departments. But I think just that focus at the top was really, really important. Their sort of ownership, making sure that each regional CFO was fully accountable. They looked at incentivization as well at those sort of senior regional CFO level. And the result is that they released a significant amount of cash. And actually, this was all in place before COVID, which was particularly important for this business.
Yes, we've seen our customers that had this sort of technology and these processes in place before COVID, I think, have definitely weathered the storm better than ones who didn't. Simply for some of them, it was the fact that if you hadn't digitized a lot of these processes and you were handling them manually, things like cash collection and so on, it suddenly became very difficult when they moved into remote working, home working, and so on. But,
yeah, exactly. They'd also done a fair amount in terms of equipping the commercial team. So as COVID came, they made sure that they joined the dots on customers and suppliers, made sure they pushed back and equipped the commercial team with the kind of scripts and ability to make sure that they weren't giving away overdues too quickly and pushing still just as hard. So that's part of why they were able to keep overdues so low during that COVID lockdown period.
Okay, thanks. All right, well, thanks for that, Paolo.